Good afternoon to everyone that's joined us so far for this afternoon's webinar. We're just going to leave it for a few seconds for everyone to join us. So we'll just give it sort of 30 seconds to a minute, and then we'll start today's webinar. Okay, just give it a few more seconds. Okay, everyone, I think we're ready. Shall we start? Good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are joining us from the States. My name is Melanie Pitsey and I'm the CEO of the Global Payroll Association. So thank you for joining today's webinar. Over the last few months, there have been many challenges and a few of those have come to light. And one of those are employees working from home and what this means for employers and employees. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've got so many people joined on this afternoon's webinar. So I'm delighted that Amedis have joined us today to present a webinar on shadow payroll and the increasingly global workforce of today. But before I introduce you to our speakers, I'd just like to go over a bit of housekeeping. We are live streaming today's event and recording. We would like to have this as an interactive event, and there will be time at the end of today to answer any questions. Generally, I feel that there's usually a lot of questions around this subject, so if we're unable to answer a lot of these questions, we will answer those post-event. The slides and recording will also be made available at the end of today's webinar, and you can also download today's slides in the handout section should you wish to do so while you're listening today to today's webinar. Okay, so let's start, shall we? So let me introduce you to the speakers. Our first speaker is Christine. Christine, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Thanks, Mel. Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Kiley and I am the Chief Operating Officer of Amedis. I've been working in the space of global payroll, tax and social security for just over 20 years now. And within Amedis, I'm responsible for the delivery of service to the customers of Amedis from onboarding through to live running. My background is I did a primary degree in Trinity College Dublin, and after that I qualified first of all as a chartered tax advisor, and thereafter I undertook the Associate of the Irish Payroll Association qualification, and then a certificate in the Principles of International Taxation from the Chartered Institute of Taxation in the UK. So over to Emma.
Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for taking the time out to join our webinar today. My name is Emma Meehan. I currently head up the tax team here at Amedis. I've been working with Amedis for over 5 years and have within 15 years experience in the tax industry. During that time I've specialised in global mobility taxes, expat taxes and employment taxes generally. I'm a chartered tax advisor with the Irish Taxation Institute and I have undertaken the IPAS qualifications with the Irish Payroll Institute. And that's me.
Okay, so we'll just kick off today just by having a little look at the agenda. So we will start today's session by looking at maybe some points behind the understanding of what is shadow payroll, what do we mean by that. And we'll soon discover then that we can't actually ever consider shadow payroll without having also an understanding of what is global mobility. We'll then move on into the practical application of shadow payroll, and we'll take you through some examples of when shadow payroll might not apply. Then we intend to talk a little bit about how to effectively utilize shadow payroll. And then we intend to conclude with considerations for the impacts of COVID-19. And we do hope then at the end to have some time for questions. So we have a lot to cover. So we'll kick off with a little look at the topic of the global workforce. The increased mobility of the global workforce does create many challenges for employers today. And some of those challenges that employers are facing would include the increased requirements to operate a global payroll. We see employers then being faced with managing the payrolls in multiple jurisdictions at the same time. And sometimes they'll even come across an obligation to actually have a withholding for the same employee in more than one jurisdiction. So that's what we would call dual obligations for the same employee. So as we progress today, we'll talk a little bit about how does that happen and how best to manage that. So Mel, I think we're coming up to the first poll question. So would you be able to launch the first poll, please?
Yeah, of course. So the first poll is how many globally mobile employees do you have in your organisation? So let's launch the poll, and hopefully everyone. Oh, is that done? Yep. Oh, now I've got internet issues. Sorry, it is trying to launch. Perfect timing. Sorry. Let me. There you go. Right. So how many? Oh, I'm really sorry. It went wrong, unfortunately.
It was up there, all right.
It was, and then it's just closed on me. So I do apologise, but I don't think I'm going to be able to launch it again. So let me just see. No, I'm sorry. I do have some results. Some people did answer them very quickly. So do you want to see?
Yeah, let's have a look.
The great thing of modern technology, I suppose.
So we got a few already.
We have. It says that 69% voted, so I'm not sure.
Everyone was very quick.
Yeah, so
very
apologies
impressive.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll just have to see what's happened there. So how many globally mobile employees do you have in your organisation? 1 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 200, 200 plus, not sure, 18%. So the highest was 1 to 50. Is that what you guys would have thought?
Yeah, I suppose it's hard to tell, Mel, isn't it? I suppose it depends on the size of each organisation as well. Sorry, Emma.
And given as well, I suppose that mobility has decreased with COVID, etc. People now don't see as many mobile employees. However, I suppose as well, just to point out in the 1 to 50 category there, where there's a fewer number of individuals drawing people's attention as well to where employees are. It's not always clear to companies now, given people are working from home, etc. So keep that in mind, I guess, is a learning point from that. Maybe those numbers could be a little bit higher in the 50 to 50 plus categories.
Yeah,
and sorry, I was going to say we also see the not sure category there as well, which is significant enough.
So hopefully we have another poll later on. So hopefully this will work. So apologies on that. Okay, so I'm just going to hide the results and over to you guys. Let me just. There you go.
Over to Emma
Okay,
on understanding shadow payroll.
So looking at shadow payroll and understanding shadow payroll, employers with employees working in overseas locations will usually have two main areas of focus. So payroll tax being one, and then employee tax compliance being another. And the payroll compliance is really important for companies, obviously, to ensure that they've fulfilled their employment withholding obligations in both the home and host locations. A key point here might be minimising exposure to hefty fines that could be imposed by authorities in these countries for failure to comply. And then obviously looking at the employee tax compliance, employers want to ensure then that their employees' tax and social security positions are managed. The term shadow payroll itself, or mirror payroll, is mainly used then in the context of employees on international assignments. So an employee then who is carrying out employment duties in the host location, they would generally trigger a local payroll tax obligation there. So this can usually be met by setting up of a shadow payroll. We see the trend internationally has been that more and more countries are enforcing an immediate requirement for local payroll. So don't always assume then that short-term visits would be exempt. Shadow payroll is not always a requirement for employees on international assignments. Just watch out and be aware of the local legislative changes. As we can see with COVID, local rules are ever changing and evolving. So it's really, really important for all companies to keep on top of these changes. And the one way to do this is to to liaise with your advisors on that. They can keep you up to date on those changes. So this is a busy slide. When shadow payroll is used, I'll just talk around through the main points here. So the basic concept of shadow payroll is that the employer reports compensation in one jurisdiction, that will be the host location, that is usually physically paid in another jurisdiction, that will be the home location. So the employer is usually required to do this when the withholding tax obligation arises in the host location. So that obligation generally then arises because the employee is performing their duties in that location. So typically then the employee will continue to be paid physically on the payroll in the home location, where social security and pension contributions would be maintained. So the shadow payroll is often operated in the background in the host location to calculate and pay over those withholding taxes that are due in that location. The employees might well be aware that this is happening, but it would have little or no impact on them. So it's very much a background activity there. And as well, just to note, a key point here is that no net pay would be delivered via the shadow payroll to the employee. We might have exceptions around that if certain assignment-related benefits are paid locally. So I'll hand you then over to my colleague Christine, who'll take you through the next few sections.
So as I mentioned earlier, we can't really talk about shadow payroll without first looking at the concept of global mobility. So we're going to just look now at the question, what is global mobility? So at the top, we just have a definition of sorts of what global mobility is. The term global mobility, it's used to describe the movement of a workforce or part of a workforce from one country to another. So global mobility, it's very important for businesses. It helps them put the best people on the job wherever that job needs to be. So that in itself then helps leadership teams to really understand people better, to establish wherever they might be based, and it also helps teams to deliver the better service to the clients. Global mobility will often then be a key component of a company's talent strategy, as it effectively opens up further opportunities for companies to engage the right talent wherever it is needed. So this brings about, of course, as well as that, opportunities for learning and development, for sharing across borders. It helps organizations really get to the next level. It gives better work experience for their employees. Global mobility then also requires coordination between many parts of the business. And that will range from HR to finance to payroll, tax, to the business unit leaders, and of course to the employees. So with all that coordination, effective communication is really key. And this really needs to be cross-functional in an organization. So then when we look then towards the global mobility strategy, we're left with considerations such as immigration, employment law, HR, personal tax, social security, relocation, pensions, benefits, and of course payroll. So there's lots to be considered here, and payroll is only one part of it, but of course everything has to really link up. In order then to effectively manage the challenges and risks of the globally mobile workforce, an organization needs to make sure that they have a global mobility strategy. So when we look then at the strategy, we need to consider the various categories of mobile employees that an organization might have. So typically in an organization, we would see, for example, the permanent transfers. We would see assignees on long and short-term assignments to different locations. We'd normally also find some business travelers and, of course, the commuter. Within the strategy then, we would normally see that there's a number of different policies, procedures, and methodologies. And it really varies a lot company to company, with there not being a one size fits all. So each company needs to build a strategy that works for their own business and their own employees. Policies are needed then on a number of different topics, and those topics would include, for example, tax, social security, and payroll, but there's many more. The importance then of the well-drafted policy can't be overstated, because what this does is it gives all stakeholders a clear picture It drives efficiencies. It also helps to prevent delays for the business unit in getting assignments off the ground, and it helps to protect against employee frustrations, which ultimately keeps HR happy. So this brings us nicely into a very dear topic, which is communication and how important communication is. And when we talk about communication, we're looking at the effective communication between HR, payroll, tax, finance, the business area, and of course the employees themselves. It's no good, for example, to have a good policy if no one actually knows about it. And so the correct internal publication of the policy is also very important. So some other considerations then for companies as they're looking towards the building of the global mobility strategy. You're looking at issues such as how big is your global mobility need? Is there a dedicated resource needed? And that'll really be driven by your own individual needs of your company. Where does the global mobility sit in the organization? And is it a function in its own right? Or is it, sitting under HR, for example, finance? How does that link in with payroll? And then it's important also to consider then, where is your payroll actually managed? Is it outsourced? Is it managed in-house? Is it centrally located? Or is it very much on a country by country basis? Okay, so a key consideration then for anyone looking at policy is whether or not they want to consider these terms, tax equalisation and tax protection. The purpose of both of these policies are basically to protect employees from hardship arising as a result of taxes imposed in a host location. And the aim of the policies generally are to make sure that an employee is no worse off from a net pay perspective as a consequence of the assignment abroad. So when we look at what is the difference between tax equalisation and tax protection, the idea of tax equalisation would be that the employee is no worse off and no better off. So it's keeping the employee equal. Whereas tax protection normally is the promise that the employee will be no worse off, but it doesn't prevent them for being better off. For example, if the tax hit in the assignment location ends up being lower than the home one. Sometimes then employers will need to apply something called hypothetical tax in the home location. And the idea of hypothetical tax is it's a behind the scenes calculation. It doesn't actually reflect the actual taxes that are due in the location or paid over. And the idea of it is that it's calculated and deducted from the employee to ensure that they receive the same net pay via the home country payroll as if they had not actually gone on assignment. This needs to then be considered along with whether or not home country taxes actually remain due in the home location. And again, this is very much a case-by-case consideration. It'll be dependent on the employee's residence status in the home location and, of course, the specific rules of that jurisdiction. And as we progress through this, we'll talk a little bit about, when we're looking at domestic rules, when we need to also look at double taxation agreements. Which brings us on to where we do see double taxation agreements being helpful. They will usually help to alleviate a double tax charge on the same income. But what we just need to be mindful of is that payroll compliance rules don't always provide for the same relief in real time. So it's important to consider the personal tax rules plus the payroll withholding rules in each location. So a topic very close to assignees' hearts and one that can cause a lot of trouble if it's not managed carefully is the topic of Social Security. And it's very important that this is carefully considered at the beginning before the employee goes on assignment abroad. And when looking at Social Security, we need to consider the domestic legislation in both countries concerned. We need to also consider, well, is this impacted by EU regulations or is it impacted by bilateral agreements, for example? So all of these aspects have to be considered each time. When we look at Social Security, what we're trying to establish is the correct country for the contributions, because typically we're coming to a situation whereby Social Security is generally only paid in one location. And that means that social security position doesn't actually necessarily follow the tax position, so it can be quite different. Usually, employees on international assignment will remain in their home country social security system, but it's very important to ensure that the correct documentation is in place, the correct certification, to allow for the exemption also in the other location. But this can become also quite complex in trying to get this right. For example, if we are dealing with the multi-jurisdictional worker. And just a note of caution as well with regard to any certificates in place from a social security perspective, just to keep an eye on the expiry date of the certificates, because they do come with time limits. So on that note, I'm just going to pass over now to Emma for the practical application.
Thanks, Christine. Okay, so I'm going to take you through now a look at the practical application, how the process works in practice, and then we will take a look at 2 case studies just to illustrate this. So how it works in practice, there's a lot of information on this slide. So we've divided out into 4 separate phases, but as a starting point in the process, it's just to highlight how important it is to establish both the home and host countries in each case. Then looking at the process over analysis and the requirements for the company and the individuals in the home country, what then are the host country requirements, having a look then at relocation, travel, subsistence rules in both countries, consider what the impacts of those are. And then again, not to forget that there are further obligations after the year end that the company as the employer and the individuals then will need to ensure happen. So the home country considerations, a key point here is establishing what the expected resident status of the employee will be. This is key really to a lot of what happens in the home country from a withholding perspective, and also in the host country as to what the obligations are there in the host countries. Another thing to consider then is whether there will be an obligation for payroll taxes to continue to be withheld in the home country, or can the employer apply for an exemption to cease withholding. This would an example here be your PAY exclusion orders in Ireland or your NT codes in the UK. Can foreign tax credits then be claimed in real time via payroll, or does an application need to be made for this, or can it happen automatically? Make sure that these applications are made on time, and so you know that everything's in place at the start of the assignment. Will hypothetical tax replace actual tax withholding? And then, as Christine was talking about social security, it's really important then to decide and make the applications on time. Will social security be applied via the home country payroll, and has the necessary applications been made to the authorities there for those certificates to be in place? Then the considerations move over to the host country. What does the employer need to do in the host country? In some cases, there may be an employer and employee registration requirement. These need to be put in place. The next question then covers payroll withholding tax. Is there a requirement to operate a shadow payroll, for example, in that host country to ensure that those withholding taxes, if relevant, are collected and paid over? Another important point to note here are employee credits and deductions that might be available, just making sure that they're being correctly claimed. They're not being overclaimed or underclaimed, so that there's less reconciliation to happen at the year end. Some benefits then in the host country might be available, so specific expat reliefs could be available. For example, you've got your 30% rulings in the Netherlands and expat regimes, Denmark, special assignee relief in Ireland. But again, just to make note of any deadlines that would be relevant there, just to make sure that those applications are made on time and that those reliefs are not lost. Do we need to do a regross calculation through the payroll? That's just something else to be mindful of. And then again, will social security be applied? The appropriate retention certificates must be in place in order for an exemption to be applied in the host country. If it's not in place, then in some cases social security will have to be applied there until it's rectified. And then do you have a process in place to manage then any payroll, tax filing and tax payment requirements? Also then just to consider relocation, travel, subsistence rules in both locations. Oftentimes tax exemptions apply around these payments. Usually you would have availability of these exemptions for a certain period of time. So it's really important to have a periodic review of those timelines. For example, an assignment could be extended. How does this impact on what might have been a tax-free exemption, or sorry, tax-free benefit at the outset? Now has it become taxable? How do we account for that, and how do we manage that? Other assignment-related allowances, consider the payroll treatment there. Are they paid net or gross? How do we account for them then via payrolls? So again, it's key really to keep up to date with legislative changes in the host countries, rules that are in place at a certain point in time. You know, we have another point there being per diems. They're treated differently in various locations. So, you know, while we might know the rules in the home country and be very familiar with those, it's important just to keep up to date with the changes as they happen in the host countries as well. So relying then on your tax experts in those countries and payroll experts as well, they'll all be able to help just to make sure that those are being treated, and not to take for granted that a relief that has applied 5 years ago is still in place when you go to set up a payroll or go to do something in another country. And then just equally important, just to remind everybody then, as obviously at the year end, there's obligations that shouldn't be forgotten about. The year-end payroll tax reconciliations, just to ensure that everything has been accounted for correctly throughout the year. If movements or changes have happened, just that gives an opportunity for those to be looked at. Year-end payroll tax filings in the home and host countries, as I said, make sure you've got a process and facilities in place to get those up to date and done in a timely manner. And then also, just from the individual's perspective, there will be tax filing or maybe tax filing obligations in the home and host countries, but also if there's any reliefs available, that would only be available through a tax filing, just to make sure they're not forgotten about and not claimed. If there's an overpayment of payroll tax in a host country, for whatever reason throughout the year, the individual's tax return being filed will help to get that back for the individual, and then maybe ultimately to be repaid to the company. Tax equalisations and calculations tie back in then to the tax filings. They would usually be done at that point in time, just to review the assignee's net stay-at-home position. What was the position they should have been in at the year end had they not gone assignment? Was there any repayments due to them, or do they need to make a repayment then due to the company for any under or over collection? And then just to ensure then that all settlement of the final tax positions are adhered to then at the year end. So we'll come along now to some examples and 2 case studies.
Emma, just conscious of time, and we've got quite a lot to go through. We're just coming up to 3:30. Okay, just to let you know that.
Okay, so we might just rush through these a little bit, and we have some more case studies throughout, so we can you'll be able to share some of the information on these through the slides that you already have. Okay, so in this case, Philip is assigned for 2 years from country X, which is in the EU, to country Y, which is also in the EU. Country X rules that Philip is exempt from payroll taxes, payroll withholding, once the certificate of exemption is in place, and country Y rules that payroll withholding must be applied. Social security position for Philip is that an A1 is obtained in country X, and that retains him in the home country payroll system, social security system. And it also then provides an exemption for Philip and the employer from social security in country Y. So Philip then goes off and registers and obtains a tax ID in country Y, and he's added then to the country Y payroll for shadow payroll purposes. A hypothetical tax calculation is carried out in country X, that's his home country, and he's paid via the payroll in country X, giving him a net pay situation as if he were continuing to work in country X. So he's no worse off as a result of going on his assignment. The hypotax deductions there mirror kind of, I suppose, what his actual tax withholding would have been throughout the period. No actual taxes are paid over for Philip in country X, so instead the hypotax is used by the employer then to fund any host country taxes. Philip's salary and benefits are reported by the shadow payroll in country Y, and just to ensure that Philip is not paid physically in both countries, then how that will be managed is an after-tax deduction being processed through the shadow payroll in the host location, which will be equivalent to the net pay that's due there. So that nets that off, so effectively there's a nil payment due to Philip in country Y. There's another case study here, given that we're running a bit tight on time, maybe we could skip through that one. And I can hand back over then to Christine to run through the next section.
Okay, thanks, Emma. So Emma just went through an example there of how shadow payroll might be run, and I thought then it might make sense to look now at some practical examples of when shadow payroll might not apply. So just moving on to the first scenario here, and we'll try to keep the pace a bit and conscious of time. The first scenario is the local hire expat. So sometimes, depending on the employer and the employee's circumstances, it might actually make sense for an employee, when they're going from one location to another, to actually fully move to local terms in that host location. So what would this mean? This would mean that the employee will cease the employment in their home location, and they will get a brand new contract in the country of assignment. So taking this approach, the localized employee then moves to the social security system of the country of assignment, and moves to local benefit systems and so on. In this scenario, then there's no need for them to be retained in the home country systems, and the employee then is physically paid on the payroll of the assignment location. And in this situation, then there's no shadow payroll requirement. So we now have a case study of showing an example of this, and that is Martin. Martin is, in this example, is assigned for 5 years from country X to country Y, and the employer and the employee were happy for this assignment then to be on local terms. So as we said there, Martin will cease his employment in his home country, and at that point then we need to consider any of the exit criteria required for a country X. So what lever documentation is required from a payroll perspective, for example. The employee Martin, he needs a new employment contract under the laws of country Y, and then he needs to make sure that he performs his tax registration in country Y, gets his new tax ID number. He will then be added to the payroll of country Y, and he's physically paid via that payroll then, with the deduction of tax, social security, and country Y pension. All ties then are basically broken with country X. Now, taking this type of a scenario, we might come to point that tax filings will be required in both locations. And in fact, sometimes there can be benefits to be gained from filing tax returns, particularly in years of leaving a country or coming to a country. And when we look at that, it's always good for the employer at that point to consider the policy. Is there a tax equalization or a tax protection policy, for example? Also, at that point, the employer might be considering whether or not they would be giving the employee some assistance in relation to the management of those tax returns filings. And when we look at this type of scenario, I'll say my final point on this slide is that it's the least expensive option for the employer, but it doesn't mean that it's always the right decision to be made, and there's a lot of factors to be considered, to see when it really does make sense to have such a lock, stock and barrel move. And some of the type of considerations, would be to do with the age of the employee and their ties in the country and their longevity in the company and so on. So we'll move on just to another scenario now, the potential scenario where there might be no shadow payroll requirement. And in this example, we are looking at a situation where there's actually exemption in the host location, so there's no requirement for withholding taxes in the host location. So sometimes when an employee might move to a new location, the domestic legislation of the jurisdiction, the double taxation agreement will be considered, and when we look at this, we're considering the duration of the assignment, the employer presence, and the recharge arrangements in place. And sometimes, having gone through all those considerations, it can be established that the employee is in fact exempt from tax in the host location. It's very important to obtain advice and make sure that the exemption, however, extends to the employer's responsibility to withhold. So what I mean by that is just because we've established that the employee is exempt from tax under the treaty, this does not necessarily extend to the employer obligation. So it's very important to check. Also, when we do establish on occasion that this does extend, quite often we find that there's an upfront application required. So it's very important to make sure that such applications are applied. There can be time limits. And whenever you do establish that, there is such a relief available, it's very important to double check and make sure that all the requirements are met with regard to the documentation being held. So as I said, in this scenario then, once all is in hand, there's no shadow payroll requirement. And I have a final scenario as an example with regard to the withholding situation. And in this final example on this topic, it's where sometimes you might be going to a jurisdiction whereby there's no actual requirement for a foreign employer to operate withholding taxes. So some jurisdictions actually have no provision for foreign employers to register and pay over withholding taxes. When this transpires, however, it will normally be the case that the employee taxation position still needs to be addressed. So the employee may still be subject to tax in that location, even though there's no provision there for the employer to be able to withhold. Sometimes in these circumstances, then the tax are paid over with the employee's year-end tax return, similar to how it would be managed for a self-employed person. Or sometimes when we hit this type of a scenario, there'll actually be a requirement for the employee to move to local terms, which is one of the earlier examples we gave. We do have a case study for just showing exactly what we were talking about there. This is in relation to Mary, and in this scenario, basically Mary went from country X to country Y for 2 years. Again, we're looking at both countries being in the EU. Under country X rules, it's been established that she's exempt from withholding once a certificate of exemption is in place. So that means no withholding required in the home location. And in country Y, we see that there's no facility for the foreign employer to register. So it's been established that the employee must settle their taxes by filing an annual personal tax return. Social security position is that Mary is retained in the home country social security system, so you get the appropriate A1 documentation under EU rules. She must register and obtain the tax ID number in the country, in the host country, which is country Y. In the background then, country X, a hypothetical tax calculation is done. She's paid via the home country, country X payroll. She has a deduction of social security, pension, hypo tax. So her net pay is kept as if she was still continuing to work in country X. No actual taxes are, however, paid over for Mary in country X, and hypothetical tax then, which has been deducted by the employer, is held in order to fund the host country taxes. Then Mary prepares and files a tax return in that host country, in country Y at year end, and then the employer will use the hypo tax fund to pay over that resulting liability. Quite often, a tax return will also be required in country X at year end. Now, this example that I went through there is one where the employer has a tax equalisation policy. And the scenario would be slightly different, of course, if there was no policy in place. So we'll move on then into the next section where we're talking about effectively utilising shadow payroll. And then, Mel, I believe we have the next poll question coming up here.
Yes, we do. And I'm hoping this will work lovely. Okay, so the next poll question is, how are you currently tracking assignees? Manual process, via technology, via service provider, a mix of tools, or not sure? So I'm just going to launch now. I don't think it's like in the polls today, unfortunately. So it's doing the same as it did last time. So fingers crossed it will actually launch. There you go. Can everyone see that? Fabulous.
Yeah, that's up on the screen, Mel.
Brilliant. Oh my God, thank God it worked this time. I only have one job. Okay, so what do you guys think? What do you think is going to be the top one for this poll?
I'm thinking manual. A manual and a mix, maybe. I'm not sure. Maybe people are more technologically advanced than I believe, but
Yeah, I think based upon the earlier poll with the numbers involved, I would be expecting probably the manual process, but that could be just skewed by maybe everybody not voting on the first one. So it'll be interesting to see what the answer is.
Okay, well, we've got 70% that have answered, so I'll just give it a couple more seconds. If we've got a few more of you to answer the poll, be fantastic. Okay, I'm going to close it and then I'll launch it. Okay, so
manual seems to be the top one there.
can you see the
Yeah.
screen? Because it's not coming up on
we can
mine,
see that.
unfortunately.
Yeah. So we have
Okay.
manual in at 36%, and then a mix of tools. So I think I was right.
Yeah, you're spot on there, Emma.
Not always right, but
So we're getting almost 60%
I'll take it.
coming in at what you predicted, all right, yeah.
Okay, Fab. Okay, I'm just going to hide the results and I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Mel. So again, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to try to go quite quickly through these slides. When we look at effectively using shadow payroll, really preparation is key. So it's important to review the global landscape and try to establish the staff movements globally. Looking at the reason and the motivation for these, because this will impact on the policy determination. Then in determining what level of staff are globally mobile, linking in with one of the earlier polls, the grade of staff will have an impact on how you actually how you determine the way forward. Very important to look at the corporate presence in the location, social security rules, as I mentioned already as well. Considering the options for the foreign employer, onto how you manage your expenses, and you centrally manage, is it managed manually, do you have an expense system? The accidental assignee can be a risk for many companies, and of course the tracking of the movements is something to just be conscious of. Moving on then to just looking at how one would go about building a shadow payroll framework, and we just have a number of steps just outlined here. I won't go through the steps in detail because I am conscious of time, but if we just quickly flick through them, we have establishing the guidelines and procedures, looking at the controls and audits, considering then about the record keeping and reporting considerations, which are very important. Training of the key employees, and as well as the initial training, I think the periodic and updates of the employees is important, very much also together with succession planning. Looking then at technology, and when we would have considered technology in the past, I think originally people would have been very concerned about the system that does the calculations for the withholding and getting that right. But more and more the reporting capabilities and analytics are becoming really key to people these days, as they can look to reduce their manual efforts that they would have been required before in pulling information from different systems. So the next slide then just brings us through a couple of examples of how things sometimes have gone wrong for people, and the type of things just to look out for. So obviously, very big concern for people is anything that would bring them to be facing fines in home and host locations. You've got the treatment of benefits can be a big problem. Social security, as I mentioned before. Sometimes when overpayments happen, the taxes paid can be lost. So they're watching for deadlines for repayments. Just in relation to the points I mentioned earlier in relation to communication being key here. So the understanding of the tax policy, making sure that you don't have the unnecessary unhappy employee. To be very familiar with the capabilities of the payroll provider and what their comfort levels are as you're entering into any of these arrangements. And also, don't make any assumptions when it comes to treatment of benefits. It definitely is not a one size fits all when you're looking from location to location. And just in relation to things that go wrong, it's not necessarily time to despair. Most things that go wrong, that there can be a resolution for them. So moving on then, just to the next slide really is just a summary slide for people, just with some of the key things to consider just in getting it right. So, we've gone through some of these things in a little bit more detail earlier, so I don't think we need to focus too much on this slide, and we can just move then to the summary of considerations, which is the next slide, Mel. And it's just going back through some of the considerations that people should be bearing in mind, as they're looking at their globally mobile workforce and the shadow payroll considerations. So it's ranging from the payroll withholding obligations, personal tax implications, social security, the corporate tax implications for the employer. Don't forget employment law, which sometimes you'll have to look at both jurisdictions or multiple jurisdictions to make sure you're getting that right. The classification of the employee is, of course, very important, and that links very much into the employer policies and what policy will work for your organisation. And then just with regard to the risk factors, so it's really a lot there about the lack of clarity can mean that the risk-averse employer might end up, for example, having to look at getting a lot of tax rulings and stuff in place. On that note, I'll quickly pass over to Emma, and Emma's going to just talk a little bit about the COVID-19 impacts and some of the trends we're seeing nowadays.
Thanks, Christine. COVID impact is, I suppose, ongoing and ever evolving. But as we started out in this process, I guess the global lockdowns would have had an immediate impact on physical location of employees. Here are some of the, I suppose, picking out some of the recent surveys and stuff that were done around COVID and how it's impacted people. I suppose the key ones here to focus on, or that we are going to focus on for the rest of this, would be, the amount of organisations that, while work from home and remote working might have been imposed on them at the outset, 74% of organisations there have said that they intend to increase remote working following the pandemic. So that's a positive coming out of all of this, I think, for people and for the companies and for employees. And reflecting on that, 83% there underneath saying that of the people who were surveyed wanted to continue working from home after lockdown ending there, an IBM survey and Gartner surveys that were conducted. So we'll see huge different trends coming out of this situation, and maybe some of those will be positive impacts on people and their lives going forward. Not so easy to see that right now, but definitely down the line it may have more of a positive impact. So we'll move on to the next slide here. So this just giving us the key considerations that we're going to discuss over the next few slides. As I said, the global lockdowns did have an immediate impact on physical location of employees. That was, be them in their home countries and having to set up work from home situations, or individuals who were working abroad who then had to be repatriated and find a way home. So we're going to have a look at how the future of landscape for global mobility has been impacted by this, and what trends will emerge in the future. So we know already that global payroll compliance is becoming more important than ever. However, we don't know how this will this impact on creating an increasing need for shadow payroll, or is that just a perception? So finally, then we'll have a quick look then over some other considerations that employers should be taking into account for the future, but also then what actions they should now be taking. So within that, we have two categories here that we're going to look at. One would be the impact on the assignee populations, but also then the impact on workforces globally. So for the assignee populations, I suppose what we had at the outset was many assignments being ended early due to those global lockdowns then, and then obviously following through from travel restrictions being imposed, people trying to get home as fast as they could. So that would have had an impact on the assignments and how they were being managed. We'll take a look at that. But also we saw employees who may have decided then to stay in their country of assignment. So they might have decided that we'll stay here and finish out the assignment, but effectively then getting stuck there due to the extension of travel bans and then the reluctance to take risks of travelling for those individuals. Some key trends then for the impact on workforces generally. So as I said at the outset, we've seen the work from home arrangements being imposed, I suppose, by governments globally, and now continuing to be encouraged to be extended where possible for their employee safety. And then the trends then that this might be a longer lasting impact than we had previously thought. So we'll have a look at the work from home situation. Employers are now becoming a little bit more flexible, which is a good thing. And employers, how are they managing their assignee populations? We see some new trends emerging, one of them being virtual assignments. So we'll have a look at that. Is this a thing of the future? Assignees returning to their home countries. So I have two examples here. I'm not sure if I'll have time to go through both, but Mel, you can guide me on that. But so the immediate impact being the return of globally mobile employees to their home countries. So we had some assignments ending early and then some assignments continuing, although they would have been continuing from their home country on a remote basis. So what's really important here for both of these scenarios is that employers kind of conduct reviews of the situation. How have the rules in the home country and host countries been impacted, and the measures that had been put in place to manage the assignment at the outset, how have they been impacted by these individuals returning to their home countries? Due to, I suppose, some of the rules and measures that were introduced at the outset by governments to provide relief and to help employers and individuals manage these situations, they were all introduced as a temporary measure. Nobody envisaged that they would be still ongoing. So a key here is saying, looking at what might have been relevant in month 1 of lockdown might not be relevant 6 months down the line. So talk to your advisors, talk to your tax authorities in the countries that you're dealing with, just to make sure that what you now plan to do will actually be the correct decision. So if you want to move on to the next slide. So in this case, I'll just run through this quick case study here. So we have an early repatriation. Maria, in this case, was assigned for 2 years from country X to country Y. So she had a withholding exemption in place in her home country and was also retained under the home country's social security system. And she was placed on a shadow payroll in the host country. So this kind of, the early repatriation and the ending of the assignment is kind of the best case scenario in some ways, because it's easier to manage for the employers. Payroll taxes ceasing in the host country. So one key point to look out for here would be a potential refund of taxes that had been withheld to date. That would depend obviously on the length of the assignment and at what point within the assignment the individual returned. So to review those and see maybe if they could be obtained through the shadow payroll, or maybe the individual might have to file a tax return after the end of the year to claim back those overpaid taxes. So then when Maria returns to the home country, the withholding is reinstated. But then on the other side of that, then you would have a requirement maybe to review that exemption, whether it was in place. Or sorry, something popped up on my screen there. Yeah, so you would have to review the entitlement to that withholding exemption in country X. So we'll move on then to the next slide.
Just to let you know, we've got about 5 minutes.
Okay. It just covers the assignees extending time in the host countries. As I said, some people would have decided to stay on there and then due to travel restrictions would have extended beyond the original assignment end dates. So it's important then for the employers to conduct a review of those. What we have in the next example, and I won't go through it in detail, is just situations whereby the individuals may not have been put on a shadow payroll in the first place because they were in a country on a short-term basis. But now if they've been detained there for longer periods than were originally intended, those measures would definitely need to be reviewed. Their presence in those countries now might trigger an obligation for the employers and for the individuals. They may then have a taxable presence in those countries. And again, then on the flip side, you might have exemptions that wouldn't have been available in the home countries now becoming available because individuals might be breaking residence, etc. So we'll move on. And again, so working from home is a new concept, and people will continue for much longer than the current arrangements. So employers are now required to facilitate work from home arrangements for employees globally, and we're seeing that trend increasing, so that will continue. But the key points here, I guess, for employers would be that they need to be aware of where their employees are. Don't assume that nothing needs to happen. Maybe they've been sent, they've said, oh, can I work from home in my home country for a few weeks, and now they've actually ended up being there for a few months. So what's key here is for the employer to sit down and actually identify where all their employees are, talk to their employees, incorporate these work from home provisions into their global policies, and make sure that the appropriate actions are being taken then in the work from home country. So what we have summarised here are some of the key considerations that they may need to take into account. They would be the payroll tax and social security obligations in that country. They need to talk to their tax people in respect of any corporate tax presence issues, what local employment law might be relevant to them. Then you've got your immigration, work permit, visa issues, and overall impact of all of these costs on the employer and how they're going to manage those. Something else that I think is important to discuss then is virtual assignments, and I'll finish on this point. There has been a recent trend in employers allowing employees to commence their assignments from their home countries. So instead of going to the host country to start their employment, their assignments, they're now starting those assignments in their home countries, and maybe will consider travelling over and back to the host country for shorter trips as needed. But then we also have another buzzword being the virtual assignments. So basically virtual assignments can be used to facilitate employees to carry out their assignments virtually. So they would end up remaining in their home country, but providing services in the host country for the host country entity, usually from their home. They raise a host of new questions and issues that now employers are having to consider in the context of global mobility. And they open up new opportunities for employers and employees potentially to redefine, I suppose, global mobility into the future. Virtual assignees can now do remotely the same job as an assignee located in the host country. So the benefits there would be reduced, would be reduced mobile mobility costs, global mobility costs, as compared to your traditional type of assignment arrangement. We still have immigration matters to consider, but overall, I suppose the benefit to the individual would be significant, but there may also be other benefits for the company being lost here. I suppose that's something that work from home will have an impact on for employers around the world. The traditional benefits gained from social interactions, etc. Employers need to now consider how they would be managed into the future. So overall then, the future landscape for managing assignments will bring a whole set of new concerns for employers, and I think it's important time now for HR and global mobility teams within companies to sit down and redefine those policies and see how they need to incorporate some of these new arrangements into their policies. So I've just summarising the last slide before we finish up then, how the landscape for global mobility and shadow payrolls is changing. As mentioned then throughout the presentation, I suppose we have had the landscape for global mobility and shadow payrolls changing and evolving constantly. Flexibility is now key, and work from home will continue to be addressed, and it should be addressed by employers, as I said, through their global mobility policies. Talk to their employees, make sure their employees are letting them know where they are at all times, and have some mechanism in place for tracking that. I've just mentioned here about contractual arrangements, how important that will be for determining, I suppose, the shadow payroll obligations and the actual payroll obligations. And don't forget that just because somebody, as I said, is working from home in a country for a short period, don't assume that nothing needs to be done. I suppose I would suggest that the default there would be that there is a consideration, there is something to be done. So find out about that sooner rather than later. We won't talk about the corporate tax considerations. I think, as I said, they're a whole webinar in themselves. But key takeaways here being tracking the employee movements and considering the costs that are associated with remote working generally. So sorry having to rush through those last few slides, but just wanted to get those covered.
Thank you so much. Emma and Christina, there is so much information to take on, isn't it? It's such a huge subject, and I can imagine that we could do a few more webinars, especially when you talked about corporate tax considerations. We have had a number of questions. Obviously, we've run out of time. I'm hoping that you're both happy to answer these post webinar. Would that be okay? And we can send those out to everyone that has attended today's webinar.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely,
no
yeah.
problem at all. Yeah, just send them on to us, Mel, and we'll look after them.
Great, thank you so much. Some of you have said that you couldn't download the slides. You will be sent a link to the recording shortly and also the slides, so you should be able to download those. If you have any problems, just ask me and I can forward them via email. But just want to say thank you so much, Amidis, for supporting us today and presenting. It's such a big topic, and there's so many people that have asked us information about this, so it's been fantastic. So thank you once again, and I hope that you'll join us again for another webinar soon. Thank you for everyone that attended today, and I look forward to seeing you all soon, and stay safe wherever you are.